Today's book follows two young kids as they summer in small town America, enjoying adventures at the foot of their eccentric grandmother, all during the time of the Great Depression. Written by Richard Peck, a long way from Chicago. Coming up next. Welcome to Read with Maren, where I bring you fun, wholesome, and inspiring stories that you can share with your whole family. Stay to the end, and I'll share with you my thoughts as well as some of the inevitable bloopers that always come. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Shotgun Cheatham's Last Night Above Ground, 1929. You wouldn't think we'd have to leave Chicago to see a dead body. We were growing up there back in the bad old days of Al Capone and Bugs Moran. Just the winter before, they had the St. Valentine's Day Massacre over on North Clark Street. The city had such an evil reputation that the Thompson machine gun was better known as the Chicago typewriter. But I'd grown to the age of 9, and my sister Mary Alice was 7, and we had yet to see a stiff. We'd guessed that most of them were where you couldn't see them, at the bottom of Lake Michigan, wearing concrete overshoes. No, we had to travel all the way down to our Grandma Dowdel's house before we ever set eyes on a corpse. Dad said Mary Alice and I were getting at the age when we could travel on our own. He said it was time that we spent a week with Grandma, who was getting on in years. We hadn't seen anything of her since we were tykes. Being Chicago people, Mother and Dad didn't have a car, and Grandma wasn't on the telephone. "They're dumping us on her is what they're doing," Mary Alice said darkly. She suspected that Mother and Dad would take off for a week fishing up in Wisconsin in our absence. I didn't mind going because we were going on the train, the Wabash Railroad's crack blue bird that left Durnburn Station every morning bound for St. Louis. Grandma lived somewhere in between, in one of those towns the railroad tracks cut in two, where people stood out on their porches to see the train passing by. Mary Alice said she couldn't stand the place. For one thing, at Grandma's you had to go outside to the privy. It stood just across from the cob house, a tumble-down shed full of stuff, left there in Grandpa Dowdel's time. A big old snaggle-toothed tomcat lived in the cob house, and as quick as you came out to the privy, he'd jump at you. Mary Alice couldn't stand it. Mary Alice said there was nothing to do and nobody to do it with, so she'd tag after me, though I was 2 years older and a boy. We'd stroll uptown in those first days. It was only a short block of brick buildings, the bank, the insurance agency, Moore's store, and the Coffee Pot Cafe, where the old saloon had stood. Prohibition was on in those days, which meant selling liquor was against the law, so people made their own beer at home. They still had the tin roofs out over the sidewalk and hitching rails. Most farmers came to town horse-drawn, though there were Fords, and the banker, L.J. Weidenbach, drove a Hupmobile. It looked like a slow place to us, but that was before they buried Shotgun Cheatham. He might have made it unnoticed all the way to the grave except for his name. The county seat newspaper didn't want to run an obituary with anybody called Shotgun, but nobody knew any other name for him. This sparked attention from some of the bigger newspapers. One sent in a stringer to nose around the Coffee Pot Cafe for a human interest story, since it was August and a slow month for the news. The coffee pot was where people went to loaf, talk tall, and swap gossip. Mary Alice and I were of some interest since we dropped by because we were kin of Mrs. Dowdel's, who never set foot in the place. She said she liked to keep herself to herself, which was uphill work in a town like that. Mary Alice and I carried the tale home that a suspicious type had come off the train in citified clothes and a stiff straw hat. He stuck out a mile wide and was asking around about Shotgun Cheatham, and he was taking notes. Grandma had already heard it on the grapevine that Shotgun was no more, though she wasn't the first person people ran to with news. She wasn't what you call a popular woman. Grandpa Dowdel had been well thought of, but he was long gone. That was the day she was working tomatoes on the big black iron range, and her kitchen was hot enough to steam calendars off the wall. Her sleeves were turned back on her big arms. When she heard that the town was apt to fill up with newspaper reporters, her jaw clenched. Presently, she said, "I'll tell you what the reporter's after. He wants to get the horse laugh on us because he thinks we're nothing but a bunch of hayseeds and no-count country people. We are, but what business of that is his?" "Who was Shotgun Cheatham anyway?" Mary Alice asked. "He was just an old reprobate who lived poor and died broke," Grandma said. "Nobody went near him because he smelled like a polecat. He lived in a chicken coop, and now they'll have to burn that down too." To change the subject, she said to me, "Here, you stir these tomatoes and don't let 'em stick. I've stood in this heat till I'm half cooked myself." I didn't like kitchen work. Yesterday she had done apple butter, and that hadn't been too bad. She made that outdoors over an open fire, and she had put pennies in the cauldron to keep it from sticking. "Down at the coffee pot, they say Shotgun rode with the James boys." "Which James boys?" "Jesse James," I said, "and Frank." "They wouldn't have had him. Anyhow, them Jameses was Missouri people." They were telling the reporter that Shotgun killed a man and that he went to the penitentiary. "Several around here done that," Grandma said, "though I don't recall him being out of town any length of time. Who's doing all this talking?" "A real humped-over lady with buck teeth," Mary Alice said. "Cross-eyed?" Grandma said. "That'll be Effie Wilcox. You think she's ugly now. You should have seen her as a girl. And she'd talk you to death. Her tongue's attached in the middle and flaps at both ends." Grandma was over by the screen door for a breath of air. "They said he'd notched his gun in 6 places," I said, pushing my luck. "They said the notches were either for banks he'd robbed or sheriffs he'd shot." "Was that Effie again? Never trust an ugly woman. She's got a grudge against the world," said Grandma, who was no oil painting herself. She fetched up a sigh. "I'll tell you how Shotgun got his name. He wasn't but 10 years old, and he wanted to go out and shoot quail with a bunch of older boys. Couldn't hit a barn wall from the inside, and he had a sty in one eye. They were out there in the pasture without a quail in sight, but Shotgun got all excited being with them big boys. He squeezed off around and killed a cow. Down she went. If he had been aiming at her, she would have died of old age eventually. The boys took the gun off him, not knowing who he'd plug next. That's how he got his name, and it stuck to him like flypaper. Any girl in town could have outshot him, and that includes me." Grandma jerked a thumb at herself. She kept a 12-gauge double-barreled Winchester Model 21 behind the wood box, but we figured it had been Grandpa Dowdel's for shooting ducks. "And I wasn't no Annie Oakley myself, except with squirrels." Grandma was still at the door, fanning her apron. Then in the same voice she said, "Looks like we got company. Take them tomatoes off that fire." The stranger was on the porch, and when Mary Alice and I crowded up behind Grandma to see, it was the reporter. He was sharp-faced, and he had sweated through his hatband. "What's your business?" Grandma said through a screen wire, which is as friendly as she got. "Ma'am, I'm making inquiries about the late Shotgun Cheatham." He shuffled his feet, wanting to get one of them in the door. Then he mopped up under his hat brim with a silk handkerchief. His Masonic ring had diamond chips in it. "Who sent you to me?" "I'm going door to door, ma'am. You know how you ladies love to talk. Bless your hearts, you'd talk all the hind leg off a mule." Mary Alice and I both stared at that. We figured Grandma might grab her broom and swat him off the porch. We had already seen how she'd make short work of peddlers even when they weren't lippy. And tramps didn't seem to mark her fence post. We suspected that you didn't get inside her house, even if she knew you. But to our surprise, she swept open the screen door and stepped out onto the porch. I followed. So did Mary Alice. Once she was sure the snaggletooth Tom wasn't lurking around out there, waiting to pounce. "You a newspaper reporter?" she said. "Peoria?" It was those flashy clothes, but he looked surprised. "What they been telling you?" "Looks like I got a good story by the tail," he said. "Last of the old owl hoot gunslingers goes to pauper's grave. That kind of angle, ma'am. I wonder if you could help me flesh out the story some." "Well, I got flesh to spare," Grandma said mildly. "Who's been talking to you?" It was mainly an elderly lady. "Ugly as sin? Calls herself Wilcox?" "She's been in the state hospital for the insane until just there lately. But as a reporter, I guess you knows that out." Mary Alice nudged me hard, and the reporter's eyes widened. "They tell you how Shotgun got his name?" "Opinions seem to vary, ma'am." "Oh, well, fame is fleeting," Grandma said. "He got it in the Civil War." The reporter's hand hovered over his breast pocket where his notepad stuck out. "Oh, yes, Shotgun went right through the war with the Illinois Volunteers. Shiloh in the spring of '62, and he was with U.S. Grant when Vicksburg fell. That's where he got his name. Grant gave it to him, in fact. Shotgun didn't hold well with government-issued firearms. He shot rebels with his old Remington pump-action that he used to kill quail back at home." Now Mary Alice was yanking on my shirt tail. We knew kids lie all the time, but Grandma was no kid, and she could tell some whoppers. Of course, the reporter had been lied to big time at the cafe, but Grandma's lies were more interesting, even historical. They made Shotgun look better while they left Effie Wilcox in the dust. "He was always a crack shot," she said, winding down. "Come home from the war with a line of medals bigger than his chest." "And yet he died penniless," the reporter said in a thoughtful voice. "Oh, well, he sold off them medals and gave money to the war widows and orphans." A change crossed the reporter's face now. Shotgun had gone from kill-crazy gunslinger to war hero marksman. Philanthropist, even. He fumbled his notepad out and he was scribbling. He thought he hit pay dirt with Grandma. "It's all a matter of record," she said. "You can look it up." He was ready to wire in a new story. Civil War hero, hand-picked by U.S. Grant, called to the great campground in the sky. Something like that. "And he never married?" "Never did," Grandma said. "He broke Effie Wilcox's heart. She's bitter still, you see." "And now he goes to a pauper's grave with none to mark his passing," the reporter said, which may have been a sample of his writing style. "They tell you that?" Grandma said. "They're pulling your legs, sonny. You drop by the coffee pot and tell them you heard that Shotgun's being buried from my house with full honors. He'll spend his last night above ground in my front room, and you're invited." The reporter backed down the porch stairs, staggering under all this new material. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said. "Happy to help," Grandma said. Mary Alice had turned loose on my shirt tail. What little we knew about grown-ups didn't seem to cover Grandma. She turned on us. "Now I've got to change my shoes and walk all the way up to the lumber yard in this heat," she said, as if she hadn't brought it all on herself. Up at the lumber yard, they'd be knocking together Shotgun Cheatham's coffin and sending the bill to the county. And Grandma had to tell them to bring that coffin to her house, with Shotgun in it. By nightfall, a green pine coffin stood on two sawhorses in the bay window of the front room, and people milled in the yard. They couldn't see Shotgun from there because the coffin lid blocked the view. Besides, a heavy gauze hung from the open lid and down over the front of the coffin to veil him. Shotgun hadn't been exactly fresh when they discovered his body. Grandma had flung open every window, but there was still a peculiar smell in the room. I had only had one look at him when they carried in the coffin, and that was enough. I'll tell you just two things about him. He didn't have his teeth in, and he was wearing bib overalls. The people in the yard still couldn't believe Grandma was holding the open house. This didn't stop the reporter who was haunting the parlor, looking for more flesh to add to his story. And it didn't stop Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach, the banker's wife, who came leading her father, an ancient cogger half her size in full Civil War uniform. "We are here to pay our respects at this sad time," Mrs. Weidenbach said when Grandma let them in. "When I told Daddy that Shotgun had been decorated by U.S. Grant and wounded 3 times at Bull Run, it brought it all back to him, and so we had to come." Her old daddy wore a forage cap and a decoration from the Grand Army of the Republic, and he seemed to have no idea where he was. She led him up to the coffin where they admired the flowers. Grandma had planted a pitcher of glads from her garden at either end of the pine box. In each pitcher she stuck an American flag. A few more people willing to brave Grandma came and went, but finally we were down to the reporter who had settled in the best chair, still nosing for news. Then who appeared at the front door but Miss Effie Wilcox in a hat. "Mrs. Dowdel, I have come to set with you overnight and see our old brave soldier through his last watch." In those days, people sat up with the corpse through the final night before burial. I would have bet money Grandma wouldn't let Miss Wilcox in for a quick look, let alone overnight. But of course, Grandma was putting on the best show possible to pull the wool over the reporter's eyes. Little though she seemed to think of the townspeople, she thought a lot less of the strangers. Grandma waved Miss Wilcox inside, and in she came, her eyes all over the place. She made for the coffin, stared at the blank white gauze, and said, "Don't he look natural?" Then she drew up a chair next to the reporter. He flinched because he had it on good authority that she had just been let out of the insane asylum. "Warm, ain't it?" she said straight at him, but looking everywhere. The crowd outside finally dispersed. Mary Alice and I hung at the edge of the room, too curious to be anywhere else. "If you're here for the long haul," Grandma said to the reporter, "how about a beer?" He looked encouraged, and Grandma left him to Miss Wilcox, who was meant as a punishment. She came back with 3 of her home brews, cellar cool. She brewed beer herself to drink, but these bottles were there to see the reporter through the night. She wouldn't have expected her worst enemy, Effie Wilcox, to drink alcohol in front of a man. In normal circumstances, the family recalls stories about the departed to pass the long night hours. But these circumstances weren't normal, and quite a bit had already been recalled about Shotgun Cheatham anyway. Only a single lamp burned, and as midnight drew on, the glads drooped in their pitchers. I was wedged in a corner, beginning to doze, and Mary Alice was sound asleep on the throw rug. After the second beer, the reporter lulled, visions of Shotgun's Civil War glories no doubt dancing in his mind. You could hear the tick of the kitchen clock. Grandma's chin would draw and then jerk back. Mrs. Wilcox had been humming Rock of Ages, but tapered off after Let Me Hide Myself in Thee. Then there was the quietest sound you ever heard, somewhere between a rustle and a whisper. It brought me around, and I saw Grandma sit forward and cock her head. I blinked to make sure I was wide awake, and the whole world seemed to listen. Not a leaf trembled outside, but the gauze that hung down over the open coffin moved, twitched. Except for Mary Alice, we all saw it. The reporter sat bolt upright, and Miss Wilcox made a little sound. Then nothing. Then the gauze rippled as if a hand had passed across it from the other side, and in one place it wrinkled into a wad as if somebody had snagged it, as if a feeble hand had reached up from the coffin depths in one last desperate attempt to live before the dirt was shoveled in. Every hair on my head stood up. "No," Miss Wilcox said, strangling. She pulled back in her chair and her hat went forward. "No!" The reporter had his chair arms in a death grip. "Sweet mother of—" But Grandma rocketed out of her chair. "Whoa, Shotgun," she bellowed. "You've had your time, boy. You don't get no more." She galloped out of the room faster than I could believe. The reporter was riveted, and Mrs. Wilcox was sinking fast. Quicker than it takes to tell, Grandma was back, and already raised to her apron shoulder was a 12-gauge Winchester from behind the wood box. She swung it wildly around the room, skimming Mrs. Wilcox's hat, and took aim at the gauze that draped the yawning coffin. Then she squeezed off a round. I thought that sound would bring the house down around us. I couldn't hear right for a week. Grandma roared out, "Rest in peace, you old..." And then she let fly the other barrel. The reporter came out of his chair and whipped completely around in a circle. Beer bottles went everywhere. The straight route to the front door was in Grandma's line of fire, and he didn't have the presence of mind to realize that she had already discharged both barrels. He went out the side window head first, leaving his hat and notepad behind. Which he feared more, the living dead or Grandma's aim? He didn't tarry to tell. Mrs. Wilcox was on her feet, hollering, "The dead is walking, and Mrs. Dowdel's gunning for me." She cut out and ran out the door and into the night. When the screen door snapped behind her, silence fell. Mary Alice hadn't moved. The first explosion blasted her awake, but she naturally thought that Grandma had killed her, so she didn't bother to budge. She says the whole experience gave her nightmares for years. Burned powder haze hung in the room, catching the smell of shotgun Cheatham. The white gauze was black rags now, and Grandma had blown the lid clear off the coffin. She'd have blown out all the windows in the bay except they were open. As it was, she pitted her woodwork bad and topped the snowball bushes outside. But apart from a scattered shot, she hadn't disfigured shotgun Cheatham any more than he already was. Grandma stood there, savoring the silence. Then she turned towards the kitchen with 12-gauge loose in her hand. "Time you kids was in bed," she said as she trudged past us. Apart from Grandma herself, I was the only one who'd seen her big old snaggletooth tomcat streak out of the coffin and over the windowsills when she let fire. And I supposed she had seen him climb in, which gave her ideas. It was the cat, sitting smug on shotgun Cheatham's breathless chest, who'd batted out the gauze the way cats do. And he sure lit out the way he'd come when Grandma fired just over his ragged ears, as he'd probably used up 8 lives already. The cat in the coffin gave Grandma Dowdel her chance. She didn't seem to have any time for Effie Wilcox, whose tongue flapped at both ends, but she had even less time for newspaper reporters who think your business is theirs. Courtesy of the cat, she'd fired around, so to speak, in the direction of each. Though she didn't gloat, she looked satisfied. It certainly fleshed out her reputation and gave people a new reason to leave her in peace. The story of Shotgun Cheatham's last night above ground kept the Coffee Pot Cafe fully engaged for the rest of our visit that summer. It was a story that grew in the telling in one of those little towns where there's always time to ponder all the different kinds of truth. We'll stop there for now. Thanks for joining us. I love this story of how they discover their grandma and the small town that they're not quite so familiar with yet. We'll see you next time. And remember, always look for the good in the world. And if you can't find it, make it yourself. Thanks for joining. Never trust an ugly woman. She's got a grudge against the world. I'm thrown off by what she said. Okay. Energy. This is how we get our energy. I used to be so embarrassed when my mom did it. Okay. Ha. Energy. Take 15.